The Frank H. Goodyear, built in 1902 by the American Shipbuilding Company of Lorain, Ohio. The Goodyear had a length of 416 feet. She had a width of 50 feet and a depth of 28. She also had a gross tonnage of 4,815 tons, and she could carry a net tonnage of 3,438 tons. She was also a steel-hulled freighter. The Goodyear received her name from her owner, who was Frank H. Goodyear. Goodyear was the owner and railroad tycoon who had developed the Pullman railroad car. The Goodyear was a unique lake freighter, this being from her recognizable Pullman railway passenger coach, which was installed as a deckhouse aboard her. The Goodyear was both a workhorse transporting iron ore and also used as a private yacht by her owner. Frank Goodyear, whenever possible, made sure that his ship was in the utmost best condition. Monday, May 23, 1910, the Frank Goodyear was traveling downbound on her normal route with a load of iron ore within her. Everything was going according to plan and as normal. However, disaster would soon befall the Goodyear. At around 6 a.m. off Point Obarks, a heavy fog soon developed. This was on Lake Huron, when suddenly the 514-foot James B. Wood appeared out of nowhere from the fog and smashed into the Goodyear amidships. As the initial collision began, the deck watch yelled, giving a warning to everybody, especially those down below, indicating the trouble above. Those who were down below rushed to the upper decks of the Goodyear, and they saw what was the horror of steel ripping apart. There was a deafening sound that was described by survivors as it made a crash and ripping sound that sounded a lot louder than the shrieking of the Wood's whistle. A sailor that was on the Wood shared his account with the Columbus News, and I quote, "I was standing on deck, having just came from my quarters, when I heard the alarm whistle. A moment more and the two boats came together. I ran forward and found that our boat had not been damaged to any great extent. I could see that the Goodyear was sinking." A sailor from the James B. Wood recounted his experience when he ran above deck and saw other sailors jumping one after the other overboard from the Goodyear. A contemporary newspapers reported that the Goodyear's passengers and crew numbered around 23 men, women, and children. There was absolutely no time to launch the lifeboats, and many of the crew members aboard the Goodyear barely got their life jackets on and even had enough time to jump out into the water. Being concerned for his family prompted Frank H. Bassett, the ship's cook, to act by fastening life jackets on his wife Lillian, also a cook, and their 3-year-old son, John. Frank's mother, Emma Bassett, who worked as a porter aboard the Goodyear, left her task of scrubbing the cabin floors when she heard the warning whistle. I can only surmise that she also felt the horrible shaking of the ship as she was being ripped apart. Grabbing a life preserver, Emma Bassett jumped over the side of the ship into Lake Huron's waters. The Goodyear sank almost instantly as it appeared, 4 minutes just about. An eyewitness report from the Wood said suddenly the Goodyear made a lurch to one side and went out of sight, leaving only a big hole in the water, and the suction carried the crew down with it. The survivors who were able to get away from the Goodyear's suction as she went down likely still held on to the hope of being rescued by the crew members from the Wood. Captain Gibson of the Wood ordered his men to lower the lifeboats and begin grabbing people wherever they could find them. To add to the chaos, the force of the Goodyear as she sank and was being filled with water was so great that the hatches were ripped from their frames and then shot into the air in all directions. Frank Bassett, with his son in his arms, only 3 years old, had almost made it to one of the lifeboats, when all of a sudden a flying hatch came at him and ripped his son from his grasp, hitting him. His father tried desperately to save him, but the young child did not make it and drowned. The crew of the Wood was only able to save 5 people: Frank H. Bassett, his mother Mrs. Emma Bassett, George Grant, Frank Moloch, and Captain Lemminger. To the credit of Captain Gibson aboard the Wood and the Wood's crew, they remained anchored near the collision scene for over 7 hours in the hopes of finding more survivors in the fog. However, when the fog did finally lift, it was evident that there was no one left to save. Captain Gibson then sailed his damaged ship, bearing a 6-foot hole in her port bow, to the Grand Trunk railway dock. In 2000, shipwreck hunter David Trotter discovered the Frank Goodyear at around 160 feet of water at the bottom of Lake Huron. This was just 30 miles north of Point Obarks. The Goodyear's bow is almost twisted off and pointing to the surface of the lake. And under her wheelhouse is a large gaping hole. A huge 6-foot deep hole stretches over behind the Goodyear. When divers first approached the Goodyear, they noted the scene of buckled plates and missing hatch covers, and high up in the fantail of the stern were the skeletal remains of one, if not more, crew members that did not survive and went down with her. They were tangled in the lines and rigging. The W.C. Franz, built in 1901 by the Detroit Shipbuilding Company in Wyandotte, Michigan. The Franz, when she was first built, was named the Uranus, and she was later renamed in 1913 to the Franz. The Franz had a length of 346 feet, and she had a beam of 48 feet. She also had a gross tonnage of 3,748 tons. The Franz was under the command of 71-year-old Captain Alec McKintry of Collingwood, Ontario. And on November 21, 1934, tragic events would befall the Franz. The Franz was heading up the lake, empty from Port Colborne, and she was actually heading to get one last load of grain from Fort Williams, Ontario, before the shipping season had completely stopped. The weather was good that day for the Franz, and she was making her way through Lake Huron, about 30 miles off the Michigan coastline. Captain McKintry retired to his cabin, and First Mate James Gobson of Port Colborne replaced him in the pilot house for the evening watch. Meanwhile, the humongous 4,279-ton steamer Edward E. Loomis was approaching. Aboard the Loomis, her first mate, Joseph, was at the helm. This was while the skipper, Captain Alex Mackenzie, was asleep in his bunk. At some point, a heavy fog began to form over Lake Huron, and Joseph, the first mate aboard the Loomis, said that he made the appropriate sounded signals to let both the Franz and another vessel, the Sordock, know that his vessel was approaching. As the three vessels began to approach each other and became closer in proximity, the Franz, for some unknown reason, turned off her course, and began going directly across the bow of the Loomis. "I threw my wheel hard to starboard," Joseph said, "and she came right at us, and it was impossible to go between the Franz and the Sordock. We smashed into her." Officers on the Franz said something happened to the steering, and the ship was out of control. The sheer force of the collision from the two vessels threw wireless operator A.D. Reeser out of his bunk and into a bulkhead. He said he quickly got dressed and went out onto the deck to see what had happened. He then sent his only radio message at 3:27 a.m., and it read, "We are sinking rapidly and taking to the boats." Reeser was one of 12 men who were in the Franz's starboard lifeboat when a rope snapped. The lifeboat then tipped and threw all the men into the lake. "I swam a few strokes until I got to a ladder floating in the water." He said this. "I hung on until a lifeboat from the Loomis picked me up." 3 other sailors from the Franz that had been thrown into the water weren't as lucky. Whalesman Joseph Langridge, who apparently was hurt in the collision, and steward Hugh Woodbeck disappeared after they fell into the water. Chief Engineer A.M. McKinns and the cook Norman Matthews grabbed the lifeboat when one end of it dropped. They were both still hanging there calling for help when the Loomis pulled alongside. Crew members from the Loomis threw out a line and someone pulled McKinns to safety. However, Matthews lost his grip and fell to his death in between the two ships. The 4th sailor to die that morning was deckhand Francis Granville, who jumped overboard and landed on a floating hatch cover. Other crew members from the Franz said that Granville tossed the hatch cover into the water before he jumped. He apparently planned to use it as a floating device. There are conflicting statements about the length of time that it took for the Franz to sink. Some say it only took 30 minutes, while others said 2 hours. The Franz was apparently struck in the port bow because it listed first to port, then went down by the head. This was the second time that the Franz was involved in a collision in that same part of Lake Huron. The Franz, when it was first known as the Uranus, rammed and sank the package freighter Governor Smith. This was in a heavy fog off of Point Obarks in August of 1906. The Kiowa was built in Wyandotte, Michigan in 1920 by the Detroit Shipbuilding Company. She was a grain-carrying bulk steel freighter. The Kiowa had a length of 251 feet. She had a width of 43 feet and a depth of 22. The Kiowa also had a gross tonnage of 2,309 tons, and she could carry a net tonnage of 1,440 tons. The Kiowa also had a crew of around 20 to 21 crew members at a time. On November 30th, 1929, on Lake Superior, the Kiowa was out carrying a cargo of flaxseed when all of a sudden a terrible November gale began to hit her. On November 30th, 1929, the Kiowa was out carrying a load of flaxseed. She was downbound from Duluth when all of a sudden a horrific blizzard brewed on Lake Superior. The Kiowa fought desperately to stay afloat. However, she sank just off of Au Sable Light, 28 miles east of Munising. The Kiowa was under the command of Captain Alex Young, and of the 23 crew members aboard, 5 of them perished. As the lifeboats were being lowered into Lake Superior, the captain and 4 other crew members in his lifeboat were overturned and thrown into the frigid cold waters of Lake Superior. They did not make it and perished in the lake. Charlie Chisholm of Grand Marais led a successful rescue effort to save the remaining 18 crew members who made it ashore from the Kiowa. Later, when the Kiowa was discovered, 2 local scuba divers, Brian Scholes of Crystal Falls and Charles E. Nebel of Munising, coordinated a recovery team in August of 1968. They salvaged the propeller blades and anchor from the Kiowa. They are both now on display as a wreck marker at the People's State Bank of Munising. I thank you so much, everyone, for joining me today on hearing these ships and the tragic events that befell them. It's a good thing for these stories to be brought up and to be remembered and talked about. And what deadly fog accidents that cause these collisions and sinkings. Man, must have been something early on the Great Lakes when all you have is fog horns and sirens and whistles to try and communicate and navigate across these great vast swaths of water. And no wonder all these collisions kept happening until technology, finally upgraded to where this really didn't happen so much anymore. But as always, guys, let me know what you think in the comments section down below. And give me any corrections or any name pronunciation corrections as well. And I thank you again so very much for joining me on this channel and helping it grow. But as always, I thank you so very much. And until next time on Songs of the Great Lakes, God bless you all.